What if I told you that education was never broken, and that it's actually our obsession with innovating the education system that's been driving down literacy rates, setting kids up for failure in the job market, and probably making youth anxiety and mental health problems worse?
As of this hour, America's schools will be on a new path of reform and a new path of results.
If you asked someone half a century ago what the point of school was, they would tell you that it's to make good citizens. And if you asked someone in Athens 2,600 years ago what the point of school was, they would tell you that it's to make good citizens. And we're not talking about mindless bootlickers here. We're talking about citizens trained in rhetoric, math, physical fitness, and the arts so that they could engage in society in a well-rounded way. The Western education model up until the 21st century was always about well-rounded participation in public life, whether it was civic virtue in Rome, or whether it was Americans trying to instill common values in one of the most diverse and complex societies to ever exist. But if you ask someone on the street today what the point of school is, I'd wager a bet that they'd tell you it's to prepare young people for the modern workforce.
New at 5, teachers play a key role in preparing the next generation entering the workforce.
But a recent shift in workforce demands now has them steering more students away from those 4-year degrees and connecting them with job opportunities straight out of high school.
And if you look at surveys that ask people if they think the American education system is broken or not, they will almost always say yes, but will argue that the way to fix this allegedly broken system is to double down on skills-based learning and convert schools even more into vocational training camps than they already are. So what on earth changed? Well, as someone super complicit in this hypocrisy, I have a few thoughts. If you don't know, I have been researching, teaching, and consulting colleges on STEM sector job markets since 2017. But despite that fact, I don't think that more skills-based education is the solution to the economic, political, or social woes facing the United States today. In fact, I blame the failed attempts to innovate the school system for a lot of the problems that we currently face. Once we allowed companies to start having a say in what schools teach, things started to go downhill. In 1983, Ronald Reagan's Cabinet Secretary of Education, Terrell Bell, published A Nation at Risk: The Imperative for Educational Reform. In that report, Bell's team argued that our nation is at risk. Our once unchallenged preeminence in commerce, industry, science, and technological innovation is being overtaken by competitors throughout the world. Now, it's important to realize that we were 40 years separated from World War II at this point. After the World Wars, the United States enjoyed being one of the only developed nations on Earth that hadn't been bombed to high hell and forced to rebuild, outside of Honolulu. So we were able to take tremendous strides in manufacturing, technology, trade, and science because we were quite literally the only people with the time and money to do so, while Europe and Asia spent the 40s rebuilding their cities from the ground up. It was inevitable that countries like Japan, Germany, and the UK would rise back to economic prominence and start to compete with us again. But when it finally started to happen, we treated it like a failing on America's part, when really it was a success on the part of those other countries. So, as the Reagan administration's reports gained media attention, Americans became heavily concerned with measuring the quote-unquote success of our schools. And as any half-wit MBA will tell you, in order to measure something, you need to prioritize things that can actually be measured, like science and math scores. Better luck next time, fun and creativity. And in order for metrics to matter, you need to put incentives in place to reward or punish schools based on how they hold up against those metrics, which meant tying schools' funding and reputation to standardized test scores, and heavily disincentivizing schools from caring about things that were unprofitable to measure, like creativity, the arts, civics, music, and critical thinking. Private companies like ETS, Pearson, and the College Board were given billions of dollars in federal contracts in order to standardize curriculum curriculums and administer tests. And thus, capital E education, as an industry of business in the United States, ripe for selling products and programs to, was born. We'll get back to that in just a second, but unsurprisingly, Americans' test scores flatlined from 1985 to 2000, as the student experience got progressively worse. Recess time decreased, foreign language programs dissipated, most sports options went away, and hands-on elective classes like woodshop or orchestra became reserved for only the wealthiest urban schools. If you lived in the country or the suburbs, then your school only had so much money for classes and clubs that weren't related to English, science, and math, the holy trinity of standardized testing. So hopefully you had an interest in learning Spanish or playing football, because that's all the cultural literacy that your school was going to bother spending money on. Problem is, and forgive the stereotyping, but most academically passionate students are not interested in things like Spanish and football. So as all of the things that made school great went away, so too did kids actually enjoying their time in school. And by 2000, it was clear that there was a crisis in the public school system, characterized by urban kids with lots of resources and options, getting good grades and going to college, and everyone else not. So in 2002, instead of correcting the failed innovations of the Reagan administration and going back to the traditional models of Western education that made America rich to begin with, the 107th US Congress under George W. Bush doubled down even harder and passed the No Child Left Behind Act. No Child Left Behind stripped virtually all power away from individual schools to set their own standards and curriculum, and massively expanded the role that the government played in how education is run, with the hopes of shrinking the gap between the lowest performing students and the highest performing students, even if that meant sabotaging those high performing students to do it. Hashtag party of small government. Don't worry, we'll get to these guys too in a minute. But long story short, No Child Left Behind was a disaster. Now, I know that some of your hands are eagerly shaking as you approach the keyboard to comment, "See, this is all government's fault." But not so fast. Riddle me this, Batman. What does the federal government do when it takes on a project it doesn't actually have the manpower to pull off? Like, say, trying to regulate all 98,000 public schools in America. If you guessed pay private companies to do it for them via federal contracts, then you'd be right. And bonus question, what does every private company ultimately want to do? That's right, make money. But when it comes to the education industry, there are really only three ways that companies can realistically make money. They either need to sell program subscriptions like Leader in Me to schools, commodify the children themselves, or they need to reform education into a vocational training ground that specifically supports the needs of their biggest donors, as something of an investment in future productivity. And who's been the biggest donor around for the past 3 decades? Big Tech. While poor government decisions triggered the decline of the American public education system, it was the involvement of big tech that's flung it into a full-blown cyberpunk dystopia, but not the cool kind. But before we can ask if job training in schools made them worse, we need to stop and understand that there are many incentive groups in both politics and corporate America vying for control and influence in this area, which is why I depend on ground news when researching for these videos, because they help me easily compare different sources, cut through the biases, and see the whole picture. I analyze the job market for a living, and it's mind-boggling how political pretty much any news about my career is. Just recently, the president fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the political responses to that were off the charts, with stories on the right saying that the bureau head was dismissed on an accusation of manipulating numbers to make the president look bad, to reporters on the left saying that Donald Trump fired her because the raw economic data hurt his feelings. Depending on your news source, you're being given completely different stories about why something happened what went wrong and who's to blame. So that's where Ground News comes in. Their coverage details feature allows you to see how many and which news sources are covering a particular story, all in one place. And their Compare Headlines feature allows you to see how different outlets frame the same story by comparing headlines across the political spectrum. Not only that, but they provide factuality metrics to see just how reliable the reporting practices of news outlets covering a story are, and even ownership data so that you can see who's funding these news publications, be it governments, media conglomerates, independents, or even wealthy individuals. Ground News is invaluable for understanding what's going on in the US and the broader world, both socially and economically. So go to ground.news/UF for a better way to stay informed. Subscribe to get 40% off the Vantage plan by scanning this QR code or using my link, which again is ground.news/UF. Ground News doesn't take ad dollars from these news outlets or media companies, so it's subscribers like us who help keep journalism transparent and accountable. In 1982, Time magazine named the personal computer as the first and only machine of the year, reflecting a broader trend where businesses began spending billions of dollars on computers for their personnel. IBM noticed this trend and concluded that computers would be the future of work in the United States. So, as an act of philanthropy, began donating hundreds of computers to schools, particularly their 5150 model, believing that this would herald in a new era of tech in education. But where IBM saw an opportunity to give back, their competitors saw an opportunity for profit. Through aggressive discounting and donation programs, Apple quickly overtook IBM's presence in the school system, and by 1990, it was touted that there was an Apple II device in every single classroom in the state of California. But Apple wouldn't stay the dominant force for long. Throughout the 90s, Microsoft offered schools computers that featured both their Windows operating system and access to productivity software like Word, PowerPoint, and Excel. Given the fact that these software were also taking off in the corporate world, it was a no-brainer decision for schools to switch to Windows, establishing the Microsoft ecosystem as the standard digital interface when it came to personal computers. And the standardization of personal computers meant that schools could now uniformly and universally administer these new standardized tests brought on by the Reagan administration and then later reinforced by No Child Left Behind. The early 2000s really was the perfect storm of political interest, corporate incentives, widespread familiarity with tech, and an obsession with skills and success amongst the general American public to completely flip education from the pursuit of creating good citizens to the perfect opportunity to influence the future of the American job market. Dr. Wayne Holmes from the University College of London has famously reflected back on ed tech as being a solution looking for a problem. And that's probably the best way that we can think about technology in the classroom over the past 3 decades. Big tech companies create some type of device or software for American businesses or the general adult public, and then have to justify how to sell it to the 133,000 K-12 schools in the United States. First, they started out by creating the narrative of obsolescence, arguing that because computers were now the norm in white-collar work, that schools were officially outdated, or straight up failing kids if they did not teach them how to use computers before becoming adults. Next, they latched on to the equity issues that Americans had become increasingly concerned about, especially as stagnating wages began to create even bigger divides between the wealthy and the poor. Big tech argued that access equals achievement, that technology could serve as a great equalizer to give disenfranchised people a shot at upward socioeconomic mobility. You know, the same hype that created the dot-com crisis, and totally isn't happening right now with AI. But I digress. Big tech poised itself as the solution to kids' test scores. Instead of pedagogy, they argued that gamifying learning by playing with kids' dopamine receptors could artificially inflate motivation by tying games and reward distributions to the act of studying. I you not, they really argued for this, leading to that weird boom in computer class games that any millennial or younger no doubt experienced. Cool math games, anyone? While technology definitely solved some problems in the school system, it didn't solve all of them, and in fact created brand new problems that were arguably more catastrophic for American society than the fact that Japan makes better cameras and cars than us. It's not going to blow anyone's mind when I say that algorithmically driven artificial dopamine manipulation reward systems aren't exactly good for children's brains. Doesn't matter if it's daily streaks on Duolingo, loot crates in video games, or increasingly radicalized content on TikTok. However, smartphones and social media are part of a larger crisis in society, and definitely aren't exclusive to the school system. What is a problem being exacerbated by ed tech, however, is surveillance, data mining, and transparency issues with how tax dollars are spent. Countless news articles have come out about the mass surveillance of kids taking place at the hands of apps in the classroom. Whether it's an app claiming to personalize studying to a kid's interests, when really they're just monitoring that kid's internet behavior so that they can better serve ads to the kids' parents whose devices are connected to the same Wi-Fi, or whether it's games apps trying to proactively addict kids to certain psychological reward systems that will then transition nicely into gacha games and online gambling once they're adults. Everything you do as a child is being recorded on the internet forever now, and it's the ed tech industry that has largely robbed kids of the chance to make mistakes anonymously, explore their own curiosities without a parent over their shoulder, or be able to have their brains develop in a natural social setting. But I'm no psychologist. I am, however, something of a professional expert on the job market, and it's becoming increasingly disgusting to me to watch the edtech industry continue to sell snake oil miracle cures to school administrators who are either too old or out of touch to realize that they're funneling millions of taxpayer dollars into hot garbage that doesn't work. Back in 2024, the LA Unified School District rolled out an AI chatbot named Ed in order to serve as a virtual assistant to their students. Ed was designed to help students with basic tasks, remind them of upcoming assignments, and could speak to them verbally in over 100 languages. However, as All Here, the company behind Ed, collapsed, so too did its $3 million contract with LA's school districts, sparking outrage over the spending of taxpayer dollars into hype fads, as well as concerns over the safety of students' data being entrusted to tech startups. And LA isn't alone in this. A few years ago, Las Vegas, Nevada, my people, funneled $70 million into new educational technology programs, opening up the floodgates to insanely predatory behavior from ed tech companies and AI startups in particular. Teachers reported receiving hundreds of emails, phone calls, and in-person sales pitches from tech startups hoping to get a piece of that 8-figure pie. And ultimately, most of those new ed tech systems that were adopted have been considered a waste of time and money, lacking in good evidence that they actually made education better in any way, and only served to deepen the surveillance and data mining of children. See, depending on the politics of where you live, there's a pretty observable trend in what snake oil solutionism your state latches onto with kids. In blue states, schools are very obsessed with the idea of equity, which at best means that they want to give every child a fair chance at success based on both their individual merits, while also offering additional resources to students experiencing financial hardship. A good thing in theory. However, in practice, this often ends up rolling out a bunch of ineffective and performative programs that turn out to be a waste of time and money, driven more by the desire for political and social clout as opposed to a desire to do what works. In red states, schools are often more obsessed with skills and values because they believe that graduating an army of young GIS technicians who are obsessed with making babies will somehow magically restore the middle class to Idaho. But in reality, banning books, changing historical narratives, and forcing skills-based technical education onto all of your kids at best creates engineers who aren't able to innovate graduate because deep down they're scared of science. Let's be real, there are reasons why blue states make so much more money in business. Or at worst, you'll end up preparing kids for an entry-level job market that doesn't actually exist by the time that they graduate. #learn to code. And while I poked fun at red states on this front, there is a country-wide problem of governments, schools, and individuals funneling money into vocational programs that may or may not even pay off by the time that students graduate. See, there is a reason why STEM degrees at traditional universities prepare you to be a generalist in the field and not a specialist. Because if a computer science degree prepared you specifically to be a full-stack JavaScript developer in fintech tax systems, then that degree would become useless the second that job evolved or got automated, or if you weren't able to find that specific job upon graduation. So in order to avoid becoming completely useless, university STEM degrees prepare you to be a generalist in the field, while also making you take gen ed classes and offering cultural resources like clubs, sports, museums, and so on, so that you can become a well-rounded member of society. However, the skills-based narrative being pushed by big tech right now is highly antagonistic to things like gen ed classes, four-year degrees, and really any other trappings of traditional education. And there are some real merits to their criticisms. Traditional education is not for everybody. Some people are just not meant for the classroom. Education in America is also insanely expensive, and so a degree taking 4 years creates a double whammy of that much more student loan debt and that much more time before you're qualified to get a real job. And gen ed classes tend to be taught by starry-eyed master's students, like I once was, who may or may not actually be good teachers. The problem is, however, is that most forms of alternative education that have come out have proven themselves to be economic failures. Associates and technical degrees are overwhelmingly labeled as not worth the money by their graduates. Even decades later, over half of people who got an associate's or a technical degree don't think that it actually helped their long-term career in any meaningful way, despite the overall trend of people appreciating their education more as they get older. And in the short term, graduates of these alternative programs have a much harder time than their university-educated competition of actually landing work in their target industry. And there are some very specific economic reasons for that, which we'll dive into in a minute. But speaking of shortened programs, there is evidence to suggest that trying to make college as short as humanly possible in order to incur as little debt as possible doesn't have the ROI that people hope for, and the reason is twofold. The first thing this creates is a phenomenon called credit inflation, where things like AP classes, concurrent enrollment, and accelerated bachelors push out graduates who have less experience, less rigor, and are less mature developmentally than their peers who are older but have the exact same sheet of paper. This also encourages a race to the bottom, where schools feel the need to diminish pedagogical benefits for the sake of appearing to the public like they care about saving students' tuition money. Trust me, if they actually cared, then they would just lower tuition, stop building eyesores, and stop having an army of junior executive vice provosts who make $500,000 a year in order to sit around and do nothing. But the other problem that this creates, while a lot more subtle, is arguably far more damaging, and that's the phenomenon of rushed adolescence. Look, I know that there are going to be commenters who think that this is stupid, but I am a literal expert on this, and I've said it before, so I will say it again. Things like the first year experience, living in the dorms, taking a year or two of experimental classes before finally committing to a major, having fun socially, and actually letting your prefrontal cortex develop before entering the professional workforce is going to make you so much more happy, confident, capable, and competitive than your peers who rushed through everything and got their sheet of paper as a 19-year-old. And I want to back that up. So let's really investigate where the Western model of traditional education comes from, what are its pros, what are its cons, and why attempts to innovate this model just have not worked. Obviously, teaching kids stuff is as old as humanity itself. Yet the traditional model of Western education as we understand it today started to arise about 1,000 years ago. From 800 to 1100, institutions of higher learning started cropping up around the Mediterranean, most notably in Fez, Cairo, and Bologna. These schools became known as the first and oldest universities in the world, which offered courses in law, medicine, philosophy, mathematics, and history. A few things were unique about these schools. First and foremost, they offered collective bargaining to their faculty and students. So while you couldn't argue that these schools were democratically run per se, everyone did have some type of a voice, which really helped to mitigate any forms of corruption. They also offered academic freedom, similar to the tenure system that we have today, which meant that professors could express their opinions or explore new ideas without the fear of getting fired or arrested just for exploring a new concept that went against the political zeitgeist. And they supported mutual aid societies that prevented foreign students or professors from being arrested or deported for political reasons, which brought in an insane amount of money, talent, and innovation to those regions because they became such an attractive place to go to from abroad in order to study or teach. And this ultimately supported foreign relations, because if you're a Muslim ruler who has fond memories of his years studying in Italy, then you're a lot less inclined to attack Italy for funsies. This system was so economically successful that when the Pope mandated a university be built in Sweden, he directed it to have the same rights and privileges as the University of Bologna, to try and spread that model across Europe. And spread it did, with similar organizations cropping up in Paris, England, and eventually the American colonies. Prior to the university system, most schools in the West were functions of monasteries, meant to give the clergy religious training. Outside of the church, education was typically reserved for the kids of rich nobles, and was done via private tutors in the home. But as Europe's economy became more complex than just farming or ruling over farmers, the need for education amongst lay people became abundantly clear. Taking pages out of the Greco-Roman playbook, European schools divided their studies into what were known as the 7 liberal arts: grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Being educated in these 7 subjects was meant to signify that you were a free citizen of your homeland, and passing them at a formal school earned you the title of being a Bachelor of the Arts. And it's important to realize that these liberal arts were meant to be preparatory, meaning that no job training was administered at the bachelor's level at universities, but was instead a prerequisite to allow you admission into higher schools for job training in things like law, medicine, or theology, or as a Bachelor of the Arts to give you access to jobs in more middle-level positions in cities like business and administration. It's pretty well documented that the average educated man in Europe wouldn't have started his first big boy job until he was in his late 20s, and that was a time trade-off that both individuals and society were willing to make. I don't know if you've ever met a 20-year-old boy before, but they're kind of the worst. And society didn't want to pass off a bunch of money and power to young men who didn't have the brain development and discipline to handle it yet. So, training young adults in the liberal arts first, and then passing them off to workforce training served a number of important purposes. It helped ensure that men in positions of power were already emotionally mature before going in. It created a shared intellectual culture amongst the professional workforce of Europe. It gave young men years of freedom to develop friendships and bonds with their peers who would also become leaders of the future workforce. And in terms of mental health, it gave young men time time away from their families to get out all of their youth angst before finally returning home, as well as giving more of a buffer when it came time to deciding what to do for your career than young people are afforded in America today. So you might be saying, okay, that's all well and good for 17th century Nepo babies living in England, but that's not the time and place that I live in. We've inherited a world where 15-year-olds are expected to take concurrent enrollment classes for college credit, choose a major at 17, graduate with their bachelor's at 21, and then get married and earn six figures before they're 25, or else we consider them a failure to society. And I agree, that shit's fucked. But I also believe that this is where embracing the proven traditional Western models of education could actually be a tremendous boon to American society. By allowing young adults more time to learn, discover themselves, and mature before we expect them to be economically viable. And if economic trends continue as they are, we might be forced into things like generational households again, where it might actually be a benefit for you to continue supporting your young children past the age of 18 so that they can really develop their own confidence, competence, and viability so that in turn they can take care of you in your old age. The truth is that education was never broken. It was only our attempts to innovate education to try to curate an even younger and younger professional workforce that was broken. And these attempts were not just at the hand of the pro-vocation crowd. If you'd like to dive deeper into why more holistic attempts to innovate the education system have failed, then watch this video next, where I break down the rampant anti-intellectualism in America's charter schools and how the idea of holistic education is probably a lot more nefarious than you realize. I will see you over there.